everyone. Myself Mansi Bal Bhargav, and on behalf of the Monday Munching and Musing with Women for Water, uh, we are really looking forward to understanding the journey of women, particularly in their water endeavors. And this is an initiative with support of Water Resources Council of the Women's Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and in collaboration with W4W Foundation and media partner Counterview. I am joined today with Sara Ahmed, Professor Sara Ahmed, Dr. Sara Ahmed, my dear friend Sara Ahmed, and we will learn from her how her journey has been. And later on, I'm going to also introduce her in detail. But first of all, we would like to hear how she has really taken her journey in water sector. So welcome, Sara. Before we go further, first I need to take your permission that this conversation will get recorded. And as I mentioned, the journey is more about understanding women endeavor in the water sector, and also to encourage more women to stay around in the water sector when they are, and also get more women on board in the water sector. As you are aware that it is really very rare that women leadership are there in the higher decision makings. When we talk about women and water, it is more about women at the vulnerable side. But we want to look at the other side of it and look at how leadership really works there. So Professor Sara Ahmed is at present an adjunct professor at ISER Pune, and also she is the founder and leading the Living Waters Museum, which is a virtual water museums, and it is associated with a lot of other associations around museum. Apart from this, she has extensively written, and importantly, what I am very eager to hear from her is her journey and her research in the field of gender and water. So welcome, Sara, once again, and thank you very much for taking out time and agreeing to do this conversation with me, so that we can actually share our journeys with other women leaders who want to really chart this path. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Mansi, and I hope that this will be useful conversation for others as well. I kind of try to break this journey into 5 chunks of time, and each of them have something that to me is a lesson. So the first one is about the inspirational part of it. You know, where did I get inspired from? And before I came to gender, I was very taken in with environmental issues and with the discourse around the political economy of the environment. I went to a boarding school in Missouri for my 11th and 12th, because my family was living in Iran before the revolution. And so when we had to leave under the difficult circumstances there, this was a boarding school, Woodstock, that accepted us. And I was the only girl in the advanced geography class, and we were taken inside the Terry Dam when it was under construction in 1980. And to me, that was a really awe-inspiring moment. We also met at that time with the Chipko movement and the activists that were concerned about the displacement and the submergence of villages in the valley there. I was only 17 years old, but this was my first exposure. And anyone who's been to Missouri and the hill environments know how fragile those environments are in terms of landslides, etc. When I was at university in England at East Anglia, one of my professors, Piers Blakey, very famous and well known for his work on the political economy of deforestation. And I did my undergraduate dissertation back in the Himalayas on the Chipko movement. And I stayed with Sundarlal Bahugna, and for 3 days in his ashram in Siliara. And I also went up to Chamoli and met Chandi Prasad Bhatt. If anyone who knows the history of Chipko, one had to be very delicate, because these two guys didn't talk to each other. And I was exploring the question of how much Chipko was a women's movement you know, like in the eco-feminist thing about women hugging trees, etc., and all of that part of it. But I was looking at it more from a class angle. And so that was my undergraduate work that took me to the environment. And later, when I started working on water, was really my PhD research in Cambridge. And that was on the Ganga and the cleaning of the Ganga in Benares, and the politics of implementation, purity and participation, pollution, etc., in the Ganga Action Plan, and what it meant for livelihoods, what it meant for faith, what it meant for civil society over there, etc. So that was not a very gendered piece of work, but of course gender came into many aspects of that work. But that's sort of from the late 80s, I made the move from forest to water. And that has always been now where I am, you know. So for me, water is so important in so many ways, because through water, you can look at faith, you can look at sacred, you can look at your body, you can look at health, food security, agriculture, nutrition, energy, power, infrastructure. You know, there's so, and of course, climate change, there's so much around water. So that's my academic background. And then I'm not going to go into all of that, but I came back from India in from the UK in 92. And I joined the Institute of Rural Management in Anand, in Irma. So now this part, so the first part is about, you know, the inspiration, the questioning of inequalities, coming from a semi-elite background and wanting to know how class and environment and all work together, and, you know, who suffers and all of that. And the second part of my journey was, I think, when I came to Anand to teach in Irma. I first joined as a visiting fellow, and I was the only woman on the faculty. I'd come from Cambridge. I had a more of an English accent. I was 28 years old. I was unmarried, etc. And there were people like luminaries like Tushar Shah. He was my boss, and Tushar, you know, has done all the work on groundwater. And Tushar just told me, it wasn't, you know, why don't you work on, why don't you build our institutional capacity to look at gender and development? And so from 92, and I think in my years in England, I was with many feminists in geography, and, you know, we used to talk about ecofeminism because that was the time it was all coming out, from the late 80s and early 90s onwards. So as students, we were activists and we were all involved in a lot of these debates. But then to actually begin to work on gender and development, to bring in the books, the analytical framework, the research thinking, you know. So the Institute, Irma, had a sizable grant from the Ford Foundation to work on natural resource management and governance. And, you know, people like Ellen Ostrom and all, and Marcus, we're all associated with the Institute in some form or the other. So I started this work on gender. I remember we had very interesting and very large workshops on gender and natural resource management, with support from Ford. People like Veena Agarwal and all came there, Jeffrey Campbell. I mean, there were a whole lot of people that influenced my thinking, my analysis, my work then. And it was, of course, difficult to teach on gender. And we started with a lecture at a time in some of the other mainstream courses like rural development. And then in about 99, 2000, I was part of a faculty committee that we did this analysis where we asked ourselves, what are the values that we want in our students when they graduate from the Institute? You know, what is it that they must know and be empathetic about? And again, I was the only woman on that committee. And my colleagues, not me, they said, we want our students to be sensitive to gender. So then we worked backwards and we said, okay, so where are the courses on gender? And at that time, I think by that time, I was offering a half credit optional course on gender and development. Or maybe it was a full credit course. But anyway, then we realized that was optional. And then we said that, okay, no, there must be a compulsory half credit course on gender issues and development. And I think Irma, even though it's a rural management institute, it was the first management institute in this country to make that compulsory for our students. And I developed and taught that course for the first 2 years. And then, of course, you know what happened after that. We had the Kutch earthquake, then we had the riots in Gujarat. And then I left the institute in 2002 after being there for a decade. But I went back to teach the same course almost 15 years later in 2016. So 2016, 2017, and 2018, I taught the same gender course, of course, to a much larger body of students. And the first thing I told them was that, look, you know, when I taught 15 years ago in Irma, there was not much of internet. Okay, everything faculty were teaching you. We had those, you know, those transparency sheets for the overhead projector. It was that way of teaching. Now, as a faculty, what do? Everything, they bring their laptops to the class. You say something, they look it up. They say, no, ma'am, this is correct, this is wrong, etc. So you're basically, as a faculty, you are facilitating a discussion. Okay. And I think some of those things that the students were raising, even 15 years ago and even now, some things hadn't really changed. First of all was the question, why is it that we're always talking about women when we talk about gender?
Yes. Okay.
That was always there. But this time I had introduced the topic of men and masculinity in gender and development. So because a lot of work had already been done in these 15 years by places like IDS, the Institute of Development Studies, you know, and also men and masculinity was not a new thing. And we began looking at that in terms of development and what that meant, right? And I also brought in male colleagues into the class to talk about other things, not men and masculinity, but they came in to talk, I think, on women and governance. And another thing the students raised in the 21st century is the question of transgenders. You know, they wanted to know more about transgenders and gender identities that go beyond the binary of male and female.
Yes.
So I think that was something else. And then, of course, the students wanted to just talk to me and engage and talk about their relationships and all the problems that young people in their 20s face in India now. So to me, that was the phase where I was contributing to institution building. When I left IRMA, I got involved as a consultant. I got involved with I was always a part of the Gender and Water Alliance. And that's a global network headquartered in Holland, or in the Netherlands. And I joined the Gender and Water Alliance Steering Committee, and then I became the chairperson of the committee in 2007, and I had 2 or 3 years over there till 2009. And so that phase, so from the questioning inequality to institution building to looking at networks, because the work that you do on institution building cannot be in isolation. You have to have solidarity. And I think in that sense, networks and alliances are really, really important. And my work with the Gender Water Alliance took me to the World Water Forum in Mexico, took me to the Stockholm Water Week many times, and also to the World Water Forum in 2009 in Istanbul, where I was, because I was the chairperson at that time, I was on many of the platforms, because many international organizations wanted a speaker, and I was the kind of, designated speaker. One thing I realized then, this is 2009, is that you end up often being the token voice from the developing world, the token Black woman or the brown woman, the token voice from the third world. And often I was on the dais with, an all white or all male what we now call manner, instead of saying panel, yes. We say manels, right? I went through all of that, but because I was articulate and strong, and because I had already had all this grounding in India and, had my field work, had my experience, I could communicate and speak about many of the issues that they were, of course, wanting to talk about. The biggest issue was visibility. How do we mainstream gender in water management? What kind of things can we do? So bringing the data, bringing that kind of thing, I think was very important. Unfortunately, when I left the Gender Water Alliance, because I had joined Canada's International Development Research Center, unfortunately, 2009 onwards was a time of the large food security crisis in the world globally. And all the funding that was being allocated for work on gender shifted to work on agricultural research, in which of course gender was important, but it wasn't water. It was more from agriculture, food security, nutrition, etc. You know, so a lot of the grants that we had been promised fell through, and the Gender and Water Alliance, unfortunately, is not the active network that it was when it started, I think, in 2002, in one of the World Water Forums in The Hague or in Japan, I forget exactly. But anyway, it's there. I mean, there's a website and there's a listserv and people can join that. And there were other groups that were working. There was a Women for Water for Women, Women for Water for Women. So WFW, something like that. And they were also Dutch based, and they were also kind of competing for funds. Unfortunately, both the groups couldn't really work together. So you also see the politics between women. You know, you have a group that is working, calls itself the Gender Water Alliance, that has a lot of men on board, because gender is about women and men and relationships and all. And then you have another group that is primarily women, but working on the same sets of issues. That group has managed to survive. That group has, you know, I saw them, the same people that I knew back then, I saw them this year in Dakar at the World Water Forum in Senegal in March 22, you know. So they have managed to get funding. And that's also an interesting conversation, you know, how does a group that, but what are they doing now? They're doing flash mobs for women, you know, getting young women entrepreneurs in the water sector, and they were organizing, I didn't see any of it, but they were doing flash mobs. And so anyway, what has happened since then also has been that the space for talking about gender and water in these water international forums has really, really declined.
Oh,
there was a time, there was a time when we were organizing side events and this thing and that thing, and you know, everyone would come and talk to us from UNDP and FA. I mean, you know, you name it, the Gender Water Alliance, we were all there. And now you go to these forums and you see aside very small events, and like I said, what was it in Dakar? It was flash mobs. You know what flash mobs are.
Yes.
There was no specific event on gender and water. So unfortunately, and I think that may have to do with the kind of language we continue to use, and the fact that many people are, that we're not innovating in our analysis on gender and what that means, right? So anyway, and in 2009, I joined IDRC, this Canada's International Development Research Center. And that also had a very strong gender focus for me, because I was leading two portfolios, one on agriculture, food security, and the other one on water and climate change. And I think there the role that I played was mentoring partnerships and mentoring our partners to think about gender. So many times in their project proposals, they used to say things like, okay, there are, you know, 3 women on the team, and that was supposed to be gender, right? And we said, no, it's also about how you allocate resources, what capacity building you do. Often you used to find, because I had very large science projects in agricultural science, and often the women were not always they were the young researchers, so they were not always very comfortable in speaking out in meetings and all of that. And but I think for IDRC, gender was significant research lens, and they tried in many other ways, because we had a very active women's rights program as well. And there was always this issue, and I think that issue is always there when you talk about mainstreaming gender. Should you have a separate program, or should gender be part of, the mainstream thing? And I don't think it's an either or, right? I think that, and they used to have a dedicated gender women's cell or whatever at IDRC before I joined. And within a year or two, it was disbanded. And it was the unexpected that everyone in their own programming, in their own, whether it was health or environment or whatever, that you would have gender specific objectives over there. Unfortunately, that did not always work, right?
Yes.
And unless you have unless your program officers are trained in gender analysis, unless there's this bottom up push as well as the top down, it doesn't materialize, right? So I think that's an issue, but it's good to see that there are many calls from IDRC where there is obviously still a strong focus on women and a strong focus on gender analysis. So that was that. And finally, Mansi, the last thing is the Living Waters Museum, which I started in 2017 and which you know enough about. But there also, I think it's really important for us in the work that we do and the stories that we are developing and sharing, that we bring in the concerns around equity and water, not just gender, but vulnerability, caste, all these questions are important. So I think the focus of the stories, the mentoring, the development of the stories, that all is something that I particularly pay attention to. And so that's what I want to see. I mean, I think it's important that we talk about water heritage, natural heritage, built and cultural, but it's important that we do so from the right lens. And that is something that I think we're striving towards. So I'm going to stop over there, and now you can ask the questions you want to ask.
Thank you so much, Sara. Right from identifying that Gaura Devi was really not getting the due attention in CHIPCO, to really taking us through the entire journey, how it has been from you sitting alone in a manor those days, to even all these years since 1992 you joined IDMA, where you started the gender and water. And you also raised this point, whether mainstreaming gender is required, or how do we really talk about gender per se and women as a different field of study as well as practice. Interestingly, you also mentioned two associations which were very much eye-opening, that Gender Water Alliance was vis-a-vis Women for Water for Women, and how the latter is surviving in the longer run. And that also gives me a little bit of motivation to really continue what we are trying to do here, to really find out that women definitely is an issue which needs to be addressed time and again. It's a different matter how things are, because and how things are taken in the mainstream. We have to continue doing another thing which was quite interesting from your conversation, was that you do mention that men and masculinity is also an important part where we need to really look at gender from, and especially when we're talking about water sector here, and we talk about how most of the decisions are male dominated, also because of the patriarchal society. You do mention some beautiful names where we have some common threads as well, right from Eleanor Ostrom or Tushar Shah and other people, Meena ma'am and all. With the summary, I will ask few questions which are more as in, how to really change the current state of affairs. You are seeing what has happened in last 3 decades or more for that matter, and you have been working. And you have been working on it, and you do see some change. At least in the academic field, you found that there were more takers of the subject. There were more questions amongst the youth about it, and transcending not only this men and women, but also to other genders, and making it non-binary. I mean, how do you think, what are important ways where we can keep doing this work and even sustain for that matter? how difficult it is to really sustain this kind of activities and also make make voice, or I will say rise up against these odds which go. I mean, from your experience, what will be the message for not only women and entrepreneurs and practitioners, but also, as you were mentioning, mainstreaming them and also brainstorming people for accommodating this kind of ideas, right? From funding as well.
Right. So one of the things which we used to also do when I was in Anand in Irma, we used to run programs for NGOs. Irma had a very popular program on NGO management, and I was also coordinating that. And we also did, in that, we did modules on gender and organizations. And we got the participants to analyze their own organizations, right? And they all came from pretty big organizations within India that will remain nameless. And I think one of the things that came up after that, and we also did this as an exercise with the Gender Water Alliance, with all our members in various training workshops, and go back, work with them, is the thing that when we come to a conference, when we come to a workshop, when we do a class, we feel all great, we all talk, everything is thing, but then I have to go home and back to my office, I have to deal with my boss, I have to deal with my colleagues, I'm the only woman there, and it's very hard. So
Yes.
that transition for them, going back into that workspace or that educational institution where they don't have the support that they did for this workshop or this 1 month course or something. And I think that is what needs to change, right? That how do we create peer support groups for young girls and young boys, young men,
Yes.
in their workplaces or their institutions or their academic environments, where they feel safe talking about their, their questions around identity, around gender, around faith also,
Yes.
and, the kind of intersectionality of all these aspects of their lives. I think that is really important. And the other one is finding mentors and leaders. I mean, I wouldn't use the word leaders, but at least mentors, that we must be able to identify women and men in their institutions or their places of work who they can call upon, right? Who they can maybe work with. So to me, building a strategy for gender also means looking at sustainability and not looking at it as just a one-off thing. I've done a gender workshop and I feel great about it. And, everyone's given me their feedback and they've all gone home. And then what?
Yes.
Like, for example, for me, when I taught the gender and development course in Irma initially, and I had some very bright students because it was an optional course, and so they were very motivated. And then later on, I heard a case about one of my male students who had been thrown out of an NGO that I also knew very well for sexual harassment.
Wow.
And as a teacher of this young man, I felt really bad. I thought it was my fault that, what did he learn in my course for whatever, 2 months? How did he do this so soon after graduating from Irma? How did he, how did this happen? I actually saw it as a failure for me, for my own thing, and I think that is something that it's not my failure, it's an institutional failure, but it is also about the spaces within organizations that people feel safe about. So to talk and teach and about gender and natural resources and all of that is one part of it. But to look at the organizational culture which supports our work on gender, which supports young women going to the field alone, going for meetings at night, what do they do? The first thing I do when I go into an NGO office, I look to see where is the dustbin in the toilet. Where can women dispose of their sanitary napkins? Then you talk to me about gender. But do you have a simple thing? Do you have a dustbin in your bathroom? And I have been in places which very articulate, sensitive organizations, nowhere to dispose of my sanitary napkin and actually putting it in my handbag and having to take it back home to the hotel where I was staying. You know, that kind of a thing, Mansi.
Very
And
small,
I'm
huh?
asking
Very
these
small
women,
thing.
yeah, but I'm asking these women, how do you work here? What do you do when you have your periods, you know? So when we talk about menstruation, when we talk about hygiene, when we talk about access to education and schools for girls who drop out because they're on these toilets or whatever it is when they're menstruating. But what about our own employees? What about our own staff? What about our own program officers? How are we ensuring their safety? And I think that is where, to me, gender needs to be, it needs to be both in terms of our programming, but also in terms of our organization, if we are to sustain the girls who are working, the young women and young men working with us, you know? So.
Do you think these changes actually require women leadership, which is what my focus is also about in these conversations? Because when we look at the statistics, it's 1 in 5 human resource in water, there is one woman. So one part is that there are women in the water sector. That's one part. But then to bring these changes, I strongly believe that those one woman, or at least increasing the number to 2 or 3 or 2.5, but then also if they are not attaining those leadership positions, by leadership positions I mean, of course, they are able to take decisions for the organization, for the projects they are doing. Not much changes actually in the lower ranks of the organization or even the work culture. And
Right.
this is where my concern is about women leadership in the water sector, you know. So even if we find many women now in environment and water, we still miss. I mean, even if I look at the ministry, the secretary, the bureaucrats, to coming to NGOs, to teachers, to vice chancellors for that matter, to bring these changes of inclusiveness, in gender inclusiveness, even if we leave aside the woman. So how do you think we can really make this leap? One is in getting women engaged in the profession, but the other leap is really a longer leap, where getting women at a decision-making position to really bring a change in the whole culture of gender. So when we talk about mainstream, what do we need to do? Because going that route is also masculine, huh? To that leadership.
Yeah, and Mansi, the other thing is that not all women in organizations, even working on water or whatever, are really concerned about gender.
Yes,
okay, let's
that
not,
is another thing. That is another thing.
So not all women. There are many good women I have met who have backgrounds in engineering and water management, etc. And most of them are ending up doing desk jobs because they don't want to go to the field, or because there are all sorts of other issues about going to the field, etc. I think having women, what's the right phrase to use? When you have rather than just 1 or 2 women, when you have that group, of women, like the voices in mass, in a mass consensus, and that of course has a lot more weightage, right? So girls are okay. I started on my own. I was the only girl for 1.5 years before any other faculty came. I used to sit in faculty meetings with 30 men, me being 28, most of them being married and having children and all of that, So, okay, but for me, I came from a background where I was confident with my education system. I had a PhD, I had a voice, I had already had leadership roles in England. So I can't compare myself to many of the young women that you see in organizations who may not have that voice, And unless women find that voice, unless women themselves are raising a voice and asking, yes, we need dustbins to dispose of our sanitary napkins. This is a wash thing,
Yes, absolutely. But then how to
but
get that voice also?
Yeah,
That is a
concern. But it's also finding allies amongst the men. Amongst your colleagues. I think finding allies is very important, because I know that people who respect me now may at one point in time have been laughing behind my back and saying, ye kya hai? What is this gender stuff? You know, it's a soft thing. Why do we need to do this? Blah, blah. You know, that kind of male voice talk in the tea club, right? I've been through all of that myself as well. But now they are the people that respect me because of what we have achieved, right?
Yes.
And I think for women, it is also hard, Mansi, because women have been conditioned for so long not to speak up and not to speak out. It is not only voices in villages when we talk about women's participation in, you know, community institutions, right? And we say women are not speaking, she's the sarpanch, but her husband is the sarpanch, etc., etc. But it's not just there, it's also in our own institutions. So finding voice when you've been conditioned for so many years, I think that is also difficult. And I think we are all seeing changes around us in the kind of young women that we see now wanting to do things and, you know, more confident, etc. So there is that visibility, there is that change. And also with economic empowerment, that kind of change is beginning to happen, you know. So as people come out of their homes, as they experience and see a new world, you know, I think those things are happening around us.
Yeah. So if we also see that many women who actually reach the leadership position, they tend to be more masculine many a times than actually being more sensitive. And that's also a very common observation when we study women as a subject, and particularly when we're talking about the sensitive issues. So if we really want to tell our younger generation like what kind of you know, skill sets they should really nurture more to stay afloat and also take a rise into a decision-making position. And one thing definitely comes out is speak your mind, and that is definitely changing. But if we want to talk about taking those decision-making positions, what kind of you know, activities they should be more engaging? I learned from your own journey that networking is an important part of doing such things, you know.
Yeah, definitely networking a lot. So Mansi, I have been accused of being emotional in meetings. I have been accused of being aggressive. You know, oh, there's Sara again. I mean, you know, we've all been through that. And
but it's good to be aggressive and emotional.
Learn. But I think if you want to be a leader, then, I mean, and I'm saying this in a random order. I mean, you know, so one is to build respect for your colleagues, to listen to them, to build respect for them, but also conduct yourself in a respectful manner. That's also important. So they have to respect you, and they will respect you on the quality of your work, on, you know, and that, I think, eventually our work speaks for itself.
Yes.
And so does our nature, and, you know, whether we're kind and all of that kind of thing, whether we listen to people. So listening helps, not being, speaking your mind, but also being careful about being too outspoken.
Yes.
Now to be outspoken is something else in India right now, so we won't go into that. But I think even then, it is always better to listen first and then understand and then speak your mind, you know. And I used to tell my children, my students, that doesn't matter if you're quiet in class, but when you see injustice around you, when you see what is happening around you, then you have to speak up, right?
Absolutely.
Then you have to speak out, because if your voice is not heard, that means you're kind of accepting the status quo of things around you. And that's when I would feel that I have failed you as a teacher, right? So I think, so for young women, it's almost as if you're carrying a double burden, because you have to prove yourself harder than men sometimes, right? But you have to find the right allies, you have to listen, you have to be respectful of others, you have to build relationships of trust, and who do you trust? because young women can also get carried away if someone finds them attractive and impressive and this and that can just go completely wrong for you, you know? So you have to be careful. I mean, we have all been in these positions, right?
Yes.
We have all been in positions when we were younger, when we were looked at differently, when men wanted things from us. And I think we all have to be upfront about that. You know, we've all been in that position, and it is our job to support women younger than us to perhaps not make the same mistakes again. I mean, you can learn from some mistakes, but some mistakes will leave you scarred for the rest of your life.
Yes.
And those are not mistakes that you want to make, you know?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, we always say we learn from things that go wrong, which is fine, but some things you don't want to experience.
Yes,
and not everyone will come out of those things, you know? So I think these days our youth face a lot more challenges than we did. The world is very ugly.
Yes. And fast is also part of ugliness.
Yes, yes. So it's ugly. It's you know, there's fear around us. There's insecurity. But yesterday in ISER, we are running this program called Water Classrooms, where we are developing content for children in middle school. So we had 26 kids, even number of boys and girls from 7th and 8th grade, from 5 different schools, from a middle class background in Pune. And I was talking to them about access and equity and, you know, caste and discrimination and human rights and how to value water and all of that. I didn't come to gender because I'm going to do that on the coming Sunday because it was already so much for their little minds. But I was so impressed with their articulation. And I was so impressed with how sensitive many of them were with the kind of actions they are already taking to conserve water, their empathy. And, you know, so when I left them, I said that, I mean, you give me hope, you know?
Yes.
That if we can build value education for our children, because to me, talking about gender is not in isolation from talking about values, talking about ethics, talking about the world that we want to see around us, right? So I think that is the larger picture. And a lot of, I want to say men, a lot of men who think when we're working on gender that we're only working on women's issues. That's wrong.
That's a myth. That's a myth. But it's also created by research. It's also created by the way research has used the word gender.
Yeah, maybe. But I think a lot of the work that we've all done, it has looked at the larger political economy context. It has looked at the larger historical, social historical context, you know, and that is really important because gender is only one part of that.
Yes.
You know. So you can't, so I think that is something that we also need to understand, and our young people need to understand that.
Yeah, interesting.
And you know, in a way also we need to be proactive. We can't create committees that address sexual harassment after a rape has happened.
It happened.
You know, it has to be there before. People need to think about these things. People need to, you know, talk about their bodies, violence. I mean, there's so much that they need to talk about that they simply, our institutions are still quite archaic in many ways, Mansi.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. But that applies to even the water crisis. I mean, we have to work proactively and start talking about it when we are talking about gender at the same time as these things are interlinked. You know, so the proactiveness is a very important sign of being a good leader. You know, that you are able to see the problems coming and you are willing to take that as a challenge to engage in. That's very important as a leader. So that brings me towards the end of the conversation with an interesting question for you, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy answering that. And that's what is going on these days. I mean, what kind of things you are doing apart from water classroom? Then there is, I know you are doing some water narratives. Please tell us a little bit more about it.
Oh gosh, so the Living Waters Museum is a fairly active space, as you know, right now. I've just had a week in Calcutta with Sukrits, and And we've been working towards our next virtual exhibition, which will be, I mean, the next digital exhibition will be on Calcutta's urban waterscapes. So I'm really excited about how that is coming along. Went to the Sundarbans for a day, but it was a very long journey and I didn't really get to talk to any people in the field because I think they were not prepared for that. But anyway, it was just good to see what's happening with that project. So we have that, we have our work in Jodhpur. We are hoping to, head to Chennai and Pondicherry soon. So there's a lot of exciting work happening. And I'm always trying to see that, okay, where do we make the connections between the water we have, the water we use, how do we use it in a just manner, where does sustainability come into it? So I think for us as a museum, you know that we're not only a website.
Yes.
Nowadays, it's become very fashionable. Everyone wants a virtual museum because of the pandemic and what it did for all of us. But virtual museums cannot just be websites.
No, you have to engage on the ground.
Engage on the ground and engage through webinar. I mean, find ways of, which we did. I mean, during the pandemic, we launched the music, the Pani Ki Kahani, and the videos that came and the dance and the performance. And it is really important. And even the things like, so we're working on Water Seeker Fellowships, round 3,
yes,
with the Social Political Research Foundation in Delhi. And I think hopefully we'll have a WWF on board as well. So that would be really good. And that, so I think it's important to find things that you are doing, whether it's virtual or physical, but not to think that a museum is just a website. It can't be. So no, I'm very happy. And Living Waters Museum is satisfying for me because looking at something new and being seen as an equal, and also having a lot of, now that I'm older, a lot of respect in the International Museum, and I mean, at least in the Water Museum network. And I am one of the women vice presidents on the global network of water museums. And I'm the one that has managed to push gender on the agenda of water museums around the world, like making them beginning to think about this in terms of our presentations, in terms of their content. And so it's really interesting to see this work taking shape in different spaces.
Different way, in different spaces.
I never thought, 10 years ago, I never thought I would be doing something like this, but it happens. You make change, you innovate, etc. So.
Yeah, and I see you are really enjoying, and it's very engrossing, the whole Living Waters Museum, because you go to the field, you are interacting, with people on the ground.
Your work, Mansi. We all have to enjoy our work right now.
Absolutely.
We're not doing it just for it's not a salary.
Yes,
so
it's not for the sake of doing. Yes. Yeah. And that is also an important thing, by the way, that we have to enjoy doing, and we have to be convinced about what we are doing. That's very, very important. Even to stay in the subject where you are working, So yes. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sara. Yeah. And I hope you also enjoyed the conversation, and you poured your heart out. And I'm really grateful that you could take this time out. And sorry for this little bit of technical glitch, which was not expected, but it happens. And you really said it right, that even the Zoom is getting tired of me. So that's
not of you, just getting tired of all of us.
All of us, rightfully said. But thank you so much, Sara. Please take care of yourself. And of course, we continue working together. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.